You're listening to The Critical Thought, where we challenge our listeners to use critical thinking when examining the teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Hi, this is JT from The Critical Thought. Got a good question that was sent to me. Why do Jehovah's Witnesses count time? Now, some people, if you're not familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses, you won't be familiar with the term counting time. But if you ever watch comedians on television, this actually forms the basis of a lot of comedians' acts when they're talking about Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, you've heard it. Once you get them in your house, you can't get them out. Don't let them in. They'll be there all day long. Well, there's a reason why when Jehovah's Witnesses are talking to you, they seem to just be long-winded. And the reason why is because they are counting time. Now, as I mentioned before, if you're not familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses, you may say, well, what is counting time? When a Jehovah's Witness comes to your home, you have no idea that he or she is actually on the clock. Now, for people who are white-collar workers, you may not be as familiar with being on the clock. But if you work certain types of jobs, you know what it means to be on the clock. So, when Jehovah's Witnesses come to your home, they actually have to report how much time they have spent talking to people about God. Now, for most denominations, that's unheard of. You mean I got to turn into the church how much time I spent this past month talking to people about God? Well, if you are a Jehovah's Witness, you do. Now, if you ask a Jehovah's Witness about it, they'll give you what is known as a Watchtower talking point. In fact, every Jehovah's Witness is given the Watchtower talking point. I used to give the Watchtower talking point. In fact, I trained other people how to give the Watchtower talking point when it came to the question, why do Jehovah's Witnesses count time? Well, each month, at the end of the month, Jehovah's Witnesses have to fill out a timesheet, just like if you are on a regular job. And on this timesheet, you have to put how many hours you talk to people about God. You have to put how many books you left with people, how many magazines you left, how many people you went back to see who you saw 2 weeks ago. That's what you have to report. Then you have to sign your name to it and you turn it in. Now, the talking point that Jehovah's Witnesses give, and it sounds like a very reasonable and sensible explanation. The reason Jehovah's Witnesses count time is so that they'll know how to manage their resources. Do we need to buy more presses? Do we need to buy more rolls of paper to print books and magazines on? Or what area of the country are people placing more magazines and books? So it sounds like a very good, management tool. Well, it's interesting that the Watchtower always encourages people to look at the foundation or to look at the history as to where a particular teaching comes from. Now, did you hear what I just said? I said counting time is a teaching of Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, if you ask the average Jehovah's Witness, he'll tell you, oh, no, that's not no teaching of ours. We never teach that anything about it. That's not a teaching. That's not a teaching. That's why I said, you want to follow through and do what the Watchtower always encourages people to do. Dig into the background of something, and you will be surprised what foundation it is resting on. Well, I will share it with you. When Jehovah's Witnesses were first told by the Watchtower Society all across the world that they will now be required to turn in the amount of time they talk to people about God, a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses were like, you have got to be kidding me. I need to tell you how many hours I talk to people about God? You must be out of your mind. And evidently, based on what I'm going to share with you, this became a real big issue. In fact, this issue became so large that it became necessary for the Watchtower writers to address this, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society sat down and had meetings, committee meetings. People who worked in the editorial staff, they sat around tables in conference rooms, and they came up with, how can we convince Jehovah's Witnesses around the world that they need to turn in their time? Well, what's the best way? You got to let folks know that this is a requirement of God. It reminds one of what must have happened back during the early times when Jesus was on earth, when the Pharisees got together in their meetings and discussed, now how can we get folks to wash up to their elbows? Now, keep in mind, during Bible times, people were many times farmers. So we understand people had dust on their arms and so forth, and we can understand that. We can understand a person coming to the table and they got all kind of dust on their arm and they reaching across the table for some biscuits or whatever. And you're like, man, you got a little dust on your arm, man. You might want to wash your hands before you come and eat with the rest of the family. So what did the Pharisees do? Well, you would think that they would simply say, look, this is just proper manners to wash up to your elbows. Oh, no. Pharisees went one better. Pharisees said, as they had their meetings and their conferences and their discussions, they came up with the idea of washing up to the elbows. We need to get God to sign off on this. Let's see if we can get God to sign off on this washing up to the elbows, and then it becomes a law, it becomes a teaching, and then it becomes a requirement of God. And that's what they did. You can only imagine how it must have sounded when they first started introducing this to people, saying, you got to wash up to your elbows, else you won't be serving God. In fact, you won't be able to come to the temple and worship with the rest of us, because we heard that you're not washing up to your elbows. That's what we were told. In fact, we've seen some of y'all eating, and y'all didn't wash up to your elbows. This is how, that's how it went. Come on, now, let's be honest. You know that's how it went. So here's the Watchtower. They want to get this counting time thing, and they need to figure out, what can we do? So they sat around the conference rooms up in Brooklyn, New York, and I just can't imagine how many meetings they probably had, because they put together an entire Watchtower article teaching them that the counting of time is a requirement of God. Now, what do you think the title of this Watchtower lesson was going to be? That's right. You guessed it. Requirements of God. And I'm going to be honest with you. I remember the first time I was talking to a brother. He says, man, we was doing some research. And he threw it out at me. He says, do you know where that counting time stuff came from? I said, well, we use, basically we use it to, decide how brothers are going to be appointed and who's going to be used in the congregation. That's what we really use it for. But we tell the friends, basically, we need to know how many presses to buy and how much paper to buy. He said, no, man, no. He says, do you realize that the society actually had the nerve to put this thing out as a teaching of God? And I was like, no, you're kidding me. I said, you are kidding me. He says, I'm going to send it to you. And so he gave me the reference material, and when I read it, I almost passed out. I mean, I literally I just completely, it was like these guys was just forging God's name on the check. And you know what happens when somebody forges somebody's name on a check? That thing is subject to bounce. And sure enough, that bad boy bounced. So let's get into the article. And we're going to just sit back, and I want you to use critical thinking and ask yourself, does this sound like something from God, or does it sound like something somebody sitting in a conference room committee came up with?
Unfortunately, we have run out of time on the show. Tune in to the next episode of The Critical Thought, where JT will discuss part 2 on counting time. Does this teaching sound like something from God, or something that was put together by a group of guys sitting in a conference room?
This program was sponsored by Critical Thinkers.